The Israeli left? Good. I hope they don't come back. I imagine that may be the response many of you who listen to NovaraFM may have to the very notion of an Israeli left. And frankly, that was once my response as well. How is it possible to have a left-wing movement in a state built on stolen land? I mean, I suppose you could say something similar about Britain, fattened as it is on slave labour and colonial riches. It is undeniable that Israeli Jews benefit from living in a Jewish ethnostate. It's also arguable that Israeli Jews are, both militarily and ideologically, conscripted into the Israeli state project through compulsory military service and intensive state censorship. Yet the notion that all Israelis are somehow complicit with Israeli apartheid, now plausibly genocide, just by being there, is reductive in a manner not dissimilar to conflating Palestinians with Hamas. It also erases the decades-long struggle that leftists have waged to undermine the Israeli state from within. To be clear, I'm not talking about the so-called labor Zionists who founded Israel, who started the kibbutzim with some fantasy of a socialist utopia exclusively for Jews, and even then, mostly just the white ones. I'm talking about the revolutionary anti-Zionist movement Matzpen, about the Israeli Black Panthers, about army refusnik organizations like Ometz Lesarev or Courage to Refuse, and more recently, the activists attempting to force the Palestinian question into the anti-government protests. As this list suggests, the left in Israel has shrunk massively over the course of the 20th and 21st centuries. The Hebrew term for leftist, smolani, is now a slur in Israel, and not just on the right. While internationally, the ongoing war has made criticism of Israel more acceptable, within Israel, it has made any attempt to discuss what's going on all but impossible. The campaign to bring back the hostages has tentatively upped its criticism of the Israeli government, and more recently begun to demand a ceasefire, but still remains committed to the Zionist principle that Jews' first loyalty should be to other Jews. Any Jewish Israeli who dares go further than that risks having their home attacked or people they love. Meanwhile, Palestinians who even name their people are routinely imprisoned. But one thing the 7th of October has proven is that things can't go on this way. Does this create an opening for the left to think beyond the rabid warmongering of the right and tired solutioneering of the centre? I'm Rivkah Brown, and on this episode of NovaraFM, I put this and many other questions to two Israeli leftists. Haggai Matar is executive director of 972, a magazine founded by 4 left-wing Jewish Israelis in 2010, and which has since grown into a joint Palestinian and Israeli platform with a Palestinian editor-in-chief. Noam Shuster-Eliassi is an Israeli activist and comedian of European and Arab descent, whose perspective is informed not just by belonging to one of the Jewish ethnic minorities that Israel marginalizes and oppresses, but also by being raised in an experimental community in Israel in which Jews and Palestinians intentionally cohabit. Both of my guests, and in some cases their families too, have faced severe consequences as a result of their resistance to the Israeli state and its actions. A teenage refusnik, Haggai spent a year in a military prison, aged just 19. Noam has faced police brutality while protesting and had death and rape threats after her private information was published in a right-wing Telegram group. Both have spent most of their lives seen as traitors to their own people, but only more committed to betraying Israel's original promise, that Jews and only Jews can be free. It's a long one, but I promise it's worth it. Noam and Haggai, welcome to NovaraFM.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having us.
Thanks for having us. It's great to be here.
So obviously you're both calling us from a place which is currently in conflict, not just with, Hamas in Gaza, but also with potentially Lebanon and a regional conflict beginning. So, how are you both doing?
Very sad, very depressed. I am grieving and mourning so many countless things. I can't even count what it is. I really am struggling to find hope and light and see any vision for the future. But yeah, it's a much tougher job for us to keep on going and keep on saying what we're saying and doing what we're doing, which makes it even more important. So I'm really, really struggling and trying to hang in there.
I sympathize with all of that. It's a very, very bleak period. There's really nothing you do in your day-to-day life anymore that's not connected to October 7th. Like it's in the war. I mean, it's just present everywhere all the time. I also feel much more isolated than I have done in the past. The feeling that what used to be, or at least feel like, marginal differences between a wider political camp, both locally and internationally, who is fighting for justice in this land, who is fighting for a better future for everyone living here, now feels like a bunch of different movements almost, with a lot of difficulty bridging between them. And that is, really, really lonely, kind of seeing friends and partners drift away in directions that we had not expected. And I think for us, especially probably for us living here and having to deal with navigating the society we live in, our partnerships in the different organizations we're in, Israeli-Palestinian partnerships, our resistance to the war, our relationships with people abroad. It's just been very lonely and difficult.
Yeah. You talk about feeling isolated, Haggai. I think, it sounds like what was already quite a fragmented left in Israel is even more so. And I think particularly for that reason, it would be quite helpful if one of you could give us a bit of an overview of what the Israeli left is, because I think a lot of people might even doubt that there is an Israeli left. But like a sort of picture that maybe captures everything from, obviously you've got the parliamentary left, extra parliamentary left, more sort of radical activists. Like, what is the Israeli left, and maybe how has it, how has that landscape shifted since October the 7th?
I think you're speaking to the Israeli left. That's it, Haggai. It's me and you. You're speaking to 2/3 of it. I mean, if I was abroad and I was looking from the outside externally to what's happening in Israel, I would also think that there is no left in Israel. I mean, I think that for so many years, we've been trying to shed light on the fact that if you consider yourself Israeli and a leftist, then help us fight Jewish supremacy and the elephant in the room and the Palestinian struggle for liberation and justice and equality. And for the year before October 7th, it felt for so many of us who are in the left and are insisting to talk about the occupation and the injustice of Palestinians, it felt like we are able to slowly maybe penetrate into the kind of mainstream Zionist, leftist, liberal people. So you think, oh, there is like a big people who call themselves a democratic camp in Israel. And for sure, they're gonna, now that there is the judicial coup and the most fascist, racist, right-wing government in the history of Israel, they must see the truth. They must listen to us that we need to solve things from the root. But then for a whole year, we went to these demonstrations. The Israelis for democracy, protests that are trying to prevent, the judicial overhaul and the right wing, Smotrich, Ben Gvir, Netanyahu government from doing what it's doing. And this is before October 7th. I'm talking about, and we were sort of like a group that still calls itself the radical bloc, or the bloc against the occupation. And we had Palestinian flags, and we were also talking about, the occupation and the fact that we have to talk about this is the root. There is no such thing as democracy for Jews only. We have to, to speak in a broader context that talks about the Palestinian struggle, and there was no room for that. But then at some point it felt like people are starting to get it, right, Haggai? Like when the discourse about refusing reserve army drafts, with the very like elite people from the liberal camp. So we felt like there is like a little bit of momentum and this mass protest and everything. And I think for many of us in the past few months, we've been watching how impossible it is to have, these fundamental beliefs that, Palestinians deserve everything that we deserve. And of course, I have a distant family member who is a hostage. And of course, I don't need to over explain it all the time, how much I care about the hostages and how much I want them home. But the overemphasis of the Israeli left on just having the quest of the ceasefire in order to bring back the hostages, and the denial and the ignoring of the Palestinian suffering and what we have been inflicting on Gaza, and the misery and the mass murder and the starvation and everything that we've been doing in Gaza, it's been largely ignored by people who consider themselves in the liberal leftist camp. So it's a truly isolated time, a very lonely time. We're experiencing silencing. I mean, I don't know if Haggai is going to get into this and what him and his own family members are going through, but it's just, we are in fear, and we are feeling that every show of basic sympathy for Palestinians, for the Palestinian cause, is being attacked in such a violent way. It's very, very hard.
Yeah. I mean, where do the political parties situate themselves in relation to all this? Like, where is Labour in relation to, like, the hostages, in relation to, the left's response to October the 7th? Like, where have all of these kind of groups fallen, like in relation to the war?
I think maybe to take a step back, kind of historically looking at what is defined as the Israeli left, and I think some of those definitions can be questioned. Is everyone who self-defines as left really leftist? But historically, I think we can identify broadly two kind of camps within the Israeli left, and the gap being the question of Zionism. And this is a very loaded term, and I think it warrants some more attention. Like, what is Zionism to different people and what it means? But very broadly, there's the Zionist left, which is Labour and Meretz, who, let's say since the Oslo years, you can say to a certain degree have been supporting a two-state solution. They are more liberal in many ways compared to the far right. And then you have the non-Zionist left. And the non-Zionist left is, first of all, it's majority Palestinian citizens. So if you look at the Knesset and our parliament, the non-Zionist parties are Palestinian parties of Palestinian citizens, with some level of support from Jewish Israelis. And kind of, I think that organizing principle of trying to understand, many times in the Zionist left, you would hear people say that the problem started in 1967 with the occupation of the territories of the West Bank and Gaza and East Jerusalem. I think the radical left, or the non-Zionist left, looks back to 1948 and tries to unravel the settler colonial nature and the apartheid nature of this regime since its beginning. And that is a very big difference, and you can see it kind of play out in different arenas. It means that the non-Zionist left would more usually be the camp from which you would have people refusing the draft. It would be the people who allied across the border with Palestinians in the occupied territories. It would be the people who oppose this war. So these are some very, very core definitions. At the same time, I think nothing is too rigid, because you have Palestinian citizens who support the Zionist left. You have a lot of people on the Zionist left who, well, maybe not a lot of people. You have some people on the Zionist left who would support a ceasefire and see and recognize the suffering of Palestinians. So I'm not as pessimistic as Noam. I'm saying that we're 2/3 of the Israel left. I think there is such a political camp. It's in dire conditions, but there is such a camp, and it is shared. It's binational, and it does have a very long history of resistance and of solidarity, which is continuing today.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, you say it's binational, but how much is the left in Israel sort of divided between Jewish Israelis and Palestinians? Like, how much are Palestinians actually integrated into Israeli movements? I mean, Noam, you mentioned having Palestinian flags at some of the demos that you attended, the anti-government demos against Netanyahu's judicial reforms. Like, were there Palestinians part of your camp, or is it quite difficult to kind of engage people because they're sort of like, well, they see you as somehow being kind of, part of a Jewish majority that they don't want to, associate with?
To some extent, there is a joint struggle, and there are different organizations and different political circles that definitely have a joint struggle. With the years, Palestinian citizens in Israel have experienced such suppression of their voices and silencing of their voices, that during the year before October 7th, and during sort of like the protest against Netanyahu's government, because it was a struggle that was viewed as the kind of like Ashkenazi secular leftist elite trying to preserve their own hegemony, power structure, the Palestinian citizens of Israel didn't see themselves as part of this. And we, in fact, the more, what Haggai was referring to, the more radical section of the left, even though I don't think there is anything radical about us. It is so basic, what we are saying and what we are demanding. I think that we felt like it is our duty to be the sort of like, would you say like Haggai, like כאילו חוצצים?
Or a buffer?
Yeah, like a buffer, to be there as reminders that, Palestinians are silenced and they feel completely ostracized and completely marginalized from this discourse. And we are here to remind everyone that there will be no democracy for anyone unless we solve issues to the deepest, roots possible. And that goes back to what Haggai was just referring to as like the traditional kind of secular Ashkenazi left. When people learn the history and when people look at, the first, pioneers in the Zionist movement and the people who saw themselves as, liberal and secular and who the people who founded the democracy, basically founded the system that was able to, ethnically cleanse and treat Palestinians from day one as inferior, and it went on to what happened in 1967 and everything. So I think from the outside, kind of looking at this camp as the ones who are supposed to represent today's, liberal side, Israel's liberal side, or the Israeli left, I think this is what we are dealing with, that there was never a left in Israel. There was never a real left in Israel. And every time we tried to counter that, or we tried to, to talk to, to the, to those issues, we are always faced with, you are too radical. Don't bring the Palestinian issue into this. Don't bring the occupation into this. We are building a Jewish democracy, and this is what we are, this is what we are faced with. And the feeling that is even more isolating right now is that we're dealing with such radicalization of the Israeli society. So we are up against the most fascist right-wing settler backing, terrorists. And on top of that, we don't really have a leftist camp that we can build a large-scale coalition with.
I think this is kind of interesting, what you say about how, leftists have always been dismissed as wanting some sort of justice for Palestinians because we're not trying to do that. We're trying to build a state for Jews. When you yourself, Noam, you grew up in Neve Shalom, Wahat El Salam, Oasis of Peace, this community that was created in 1978 as this experiment in coexistence. As far as I'm aware, you speak Arabic as well as Hebrew and English. Like, what do you make now of that kind of project of peaceful coexistence, and how well has that worked? Is that something that leftists should be aspiring to? Is it proof that of something that leftists are arguing, or was it some sort of exception to the rule?
It's a really long and it's a whole podcast
of itself
episode of itself, but I will try to make it short. Unfortunately, I am fluent in Hebrew, Arabic, and English, so I'm consuming, all three, all three. It's insane to be consuming news at this time in all three languages. It's truly I feel like my mind is exploding every day. My parents. My father is a son of Holocaust survivors from Romania, and my mom is Iranian Jewish. She was born in Iran, and my parents they've been together since high school, and they formed their political and social awareness together. They don't come from leftist homes at all. In fact, my grandparents came here in the late 50s and were really poor, really struggling. I think probably most of your listeners know that people were treated like shit here. I mean, especially my Iranian Jewish family, they were, brown, kind of Middle Eastern looking, Mizrahi immigrants who were put in these transitional camps and were then put in development camps and were treated really, really badly by the establishment. Including the change of their names and all sorts of things that we can get into later if we have more time. And my parents, being like a mixed Ashkenazi Mizrahi couple, they kind of, I think, understood together that something is wrong here in the framework, in the system, in the injustice, in the inequality, and they became politically engaged and involved, and they started protesting and demonstrating. And then my father, who was also a refusenik, just like Haggai. Haggai and my father look a bit alike, actually. it's really fun. He's like the young refusenik. My dad refused military reserve drafts in the first Intifada and was going in and out of military detention when I was a little girl. And so I grew up in a very political household, and my parents heard about this new evolving community of Palestinian citizens of Israel and, Israeli Jews who are forming this community called Neve Shalom, the Oasis of Peace, in Arabic, Wahat al-Salam. And they were very idealistic. Like, they wanted their children to have an alternative. They wanted me and my brother to study Arabic, to grow up in not only bilingual but bi-narrative. That I learned from my Palestinian neighbors and aunties and educators and friends from a very, very young age, the truth about what happened in 1948, where are we living? What is this land? What really happened? And so this was really from a young age, I realized and I knew that I am growing up very, very differently from the way that most Israelis are growing up. And with that, hand in hand with that, I realized that the peace camp that I'm being raised into is a very limited peace camp. Not many people are feeling part of it. A lot of communities are feeling isolated from it. A lot of people are feeling like they are, marginalized from it. And with the Oslo agreements, that's when we moved there. And after that, basically my whole childhood and my whole adult life, I have been experiencing the failure of what my parents tried to do. Maybe on a personal level and on a community level, we have this attempt. We're still living together. We're trying to create an alternative reality. There is a truthful attempt to, with the education system and with the attempt to live together and to create, a few educational institutions, to live together, but on a large scale. I think on a large scale, I mean, it is very, very hard to deal with the failure that is external to us, while there is, in the community, some elements that do work, like the fact, that I didn't serve in the army, and like the fact that I'm posing an alternative by being a Jewish woman who is, speaking Arabic, not for intelligence purposes, but for, the purposes of living and using this language for other purposes. And so it's a very mixed experience, where also in my stand-up and my comedy, I try to deal with how failed the peace camp is, but on the other hand, how it shaped me to grow up the way that I did, with Palestinians.
Yeah, it sounds like it was quite an exceptional experience and kind of unrealistic to create this oasis. It's kind of funny how the metaphor of the oasis does imply that everything around it is a desert, and it's sort of probably only become more like that over time.
Yeah. Every time I type Neve Shalom on my iPhone, it autocorrects it to Never Shalom.
Well, there you go. The perils of having a multilingual iPhone. But it's interesting because, Haggai, I'm also aware that you yourself have, had a leftist upbringing, which I imagine is what meant that you were so politicized as a teenager that you were a refusenick. But do you want to just very briefly tell us about that and how it kind of shaped your own politics?
Sure. I think I did grow up in a leftist house. My mother is still very active in the solidarity movement with Palestinians and resistance to the apartheid regime. I think for me, the shift on a very personal level from being kind of like standard Jewish Ashkenazi Israeli, like in an affluent Tel Aviv suburb, thinking, yeah, we want peace, and kind of that very broad definition of what the Israeli left is. The shift for me was when I started going to the West Bank as a teenager. And I think more than anything else, alongside, of course, the upbringing, but it was really going there and seeing what the occupation looks like.
Were you just going, like you just sort of took yourself off there, or was there some sort of trip that was organized as part of, like, how did you end up there?
It was. It started with actually being invited by one of my teachers at school to a shared Israeli-Palestinian Jordanian summer camp. And then after that, like when the second Intifada broke out, I just joined these kind of solidarity convoys into the West Bank, which were both kind of delivering aid and a political message against the siege and the occupation. It was really being there and seeing the reality there that very deeply kind of shook my identity and my beliefs, from saying, well, there's us and them, there's us Jews, there's them Palestinians. We're two separate groups. We might want peace, but the affiliation, the basic affiliation is with my national group. I think after being there, after being involved for many, many years since in shared activism, my very basic understanding, my very basic identity has been fractured and changed to saying, I am in full solidarity with everyone who's fighting for a better future for this place. I'm in full solidarity with the Palestinians, recognizing my privilege and utilizing that to resist this regime with the hope of making this a better place. And we have enemies that are people who are fundamentalists and reject this vision. And that, us and them, is very, very different from kind of the standard breakdown of politics and of identities in most of our communities.
Yeah, I mean, you yourself run a binational community of your own, quite different to Neve Shalom, but still, comparable in some ways, 972. It's an Israeli and Palestinian journalism platform. And I think your sense of that need for collaboration and sort of, a co-created project was sharpened actually, quite recently. Obviously, it's always been about that. But a couple of years ago, you sort of updated your About page to highlight that your journalism would be intersectional and to sort of emphasize that you were going to center Palestinian perspectives. Obviously, you have this Hebrew language sister site, Local Call, which is clearly targeted as an Israeli audience and has its own sort of objectives, although those seem to not be entirely dissimilar to 972's. I'm interested in how you hold that tension, centering Palestinian perspectives whilst also trying to bring along a sort of Israeli audience that might have quite a lot of prejudices towards Palestinians, and how easy it is to actually create sort of a more just society within the project that you're running.
It's a huge challenge, and like you said, the project has changed over the years. It was from the beginning meant to center kind of this community of people who aspire for a just future for everyone, but it was kind of majority Jewish. And we have gone through kind of a strategic process of rebuilding the organization as a binational project, which means that the editor-in-chief of 972 currently is Palestinian, and half the team is Palestinian. And we really have gotten to the point where almost 50% of the content on 972 magazine comes from Palestinians from across the land and in the diaspora as well. I think that's really essential. And creating this model, also this kind of oasis, if you will, of what things could look like, what it means to operate on a day-to-day basis from a place of equality within our team and in the way that we think about our content, about the stories we tell, about the voices we center. What does it mean to come from that perspective and envision a different future, which I think is something that's really lacking right now. I think part of the difference between us in kind of the left right now resist the war and so many people who support the war, even though they might self-describe as leftists, or at least used to until October 7th, is that we have a very clear vision of what we want to see here. We have the ability to imagine a different construct that would offer peace and security and equality to everyone. Whereas I think for many people who have been kind of peripherally interested in the Palestinian issue and thought, yeah, the right thing to do is to have a Palestinian state and we're pro-peace and so on. For them, since October 7th, they can't imagine how do these communities live together on the same piece of land. They can't imagine how to move forward after the massacre of October 7th. And they're stuck on that date, kind of, just missing out everything that's happened since. I think it's been very difficult to get people to follow what's been happening in Gaza, to understand that, but also to care because there's an alternative. One of our problems is that people, even the people who are aware of what's happening in Gaza, don't think that there's an alternative. They can't imagine anything but trying to annihilate Hamas. And I think we offer some sort of an alternative to that.
I sort of want to rewind a little bit because, Noam, you mentioned in your comments earlier that you feel like there has never really been a left in Israel, but it is obviously interesting because the far-right present government does tend, I think, to make people forget that Israel's founders didn't consider themselves, right-wing, wouldn't have described themselves as, some of the ministers in the cabinet today as like fascists. They considered themselves politically either moderate or even on the left, including the first prime minister of Israel, David Ben-Gurion. These people thought they were socialists, labor Zionists, created kibbutzim so that they could be peasants. Some of them, forsook their bourgeois profession so that they could work on the land. Obviously, some of this land was built over the ruins of Palestinian villages. But it is interesting that, you know, for most of the 20th century, particularly during the wars, the Six-Day War, the Yom Kippur War, Israel was seen by the left internationally, particularly the USSR, which gave lots of support to the kind of young Israeli state, as a fundamentally socialist project. How do we now understand that history that understood itself as part of a broader trajectory of left-wing struggle?
We now understand history. Everything you see unfolding in front of you is directly connected to history. I mean, the fact that Israel can just decide, you know, what food and what water and what electricity and you know, what is the destiny of everyone in Gaza, and this mass destruction and mass killing. It's a continuation. It's not out of the blue. It's not out of nowhere. And I think that my political upbringing in terms of growing up politically only began when I had an opportunity to dive into my Mizrahi history and identity. Because when I first met the leader of the Israeli Black Panthers, Reuven Abargil, who was born in Morocco, and he told me that out of all the things that the Black Panthers tried to do in order to address the inequality between Ashkenazi Jews and non-Ashkenazi Jews, and you know, they had very like heroic kind of like protesting methods. They would like take milk from really, really privileged parts of like Jewish, like West Jerusalem, and try to bring it to like a really like hardcore, very poor Mizrahi neighborhood in Jerusalem. Like they would do things that would internally shake up people and would make them see the inequality between Ashkenazi Jews, like the privileged elite, and you know, the way that the Jewish like immigrants from Muslim and Arab and North African countries are treated. But he told me the minute they tried to cross the line and make this struggle connect somehow to the Palestinian oppression and the Palestinian struggle, that's when it started being a national threat to the Israeli authorities. And that's when they revoked some of their citizenship. And that's when the Mossad got in. And that's when they were, you know, I mean, this is another episode that, you know, that you should do about the Israeli Black Panthers. And I think this is when I kind of like, you know, as a teenager, I was like, oh, wait, the story here is even bigger than I think. Because what Reuven used to tell me is that if you want to know how badly the Palestinians are treated, just look how badly some Jews are being treated. And if an Israeli establishment can treat Jews this way, just imagine what they do to Palestinians. And I look at the hostage families today, and I think of what he told me back then. If Israel can look at hostage families and tell them, and I don't know if it gets to the UK media, I don't know how much you're getting any of the ways in which Israelis are being treated by their own leaders. I mean, leaders, it's really a, you know, over the top category to call them leader. But if this, you know, criminal prime minister has the audacity, he hasn't taken responsibility, and he hasn't met a single hostage family that have lost a family member, or you know, but when the 4 hostages that were just rescued a few days ago, he was there within 15 minutes for the photos, for the hugging. Take a look at the ways in which some Israelis are treated, some Jews are treated by the Israeli establishment, and that should tell you everything.
Yeah, about the supposed socialist credentials of the kind of original Israeli state. Yeah, for sure. That's interesting. Yeah, Haggai, do you feel like that was a delusion? The idea that Zionist socialism, is that just a contradiction in terms?
I think, I mean, there are 2 layers to this. Like, one was the kind of original sin or sins of the Zionist movement. And in this, we're talking about trying to create what they really thought of as a socialist project. I do think that they believed in it. You see what they were teaching in schools. You see the way that they set up the state in terms of the very honorable place of unions. There was an attempt to create some layer of a socialist experiment or society, but it was built on at least 2 levels of colonial oppression, as Noam is saying. Like, one is taking over Palestinian land and performing the Nakba and oppressing Palestinians for the first 19 years under a military regime and so on. So there's that aspect of the whole socialist project being only for Jews, and then also within that group, mostly for Ashkenazi Jews, and even more exclusively within the kibbutzim, which you can go and see, like, are lovely places, but represent like 1 or 2% of society. So it's the story of a single kibbutz doesn't tell you anything, or even the kibbutz movement doesn't really tell you anything about the movement more in full. So that's one failure. I think the other is the one that we're seeing throughout history, where the Labour Party, that used to be the governing party, for many, many years kind of really espoused to equality, kind of pending or putting aside those 2 small or rather large kind of asterisks on, but not to Palestinians and not to Mizrahi Jews. But there was some attempt to create a socialist agenda, and even that has deteriorated and shifted over the years. So we're seeing in the 70s, and especially over the 80s, not unlike the left in many other places. People in the UK can perhaps think back of kind of New Labour and Tony Blair. We had that already in the 80s. Basically, a Labour reinventing itself as an elite party, as the party of the bourgeoisie, of the highly educated sections of society, and not of working people. And that shift has been very, very considerable. And it's where we are today to a great degree, where most of society accepts kind of liberal capitalist or not so liberal capitalist agendas.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I also want to go back to what you were talking about, Noam, which you sort of introduced it, and I also wanted to sort of introduce it myself, and so maybe I'll just sort of touch back on the Israeli Black Panthers. So yeah, I think one of the groups that are not served, as you were saying, Haggai, as well, by this Jewish ethnostate are non-white Jews, or like Jews who aren't from Eastern Europe, or kind of East and Central Europe, or what we call Ashkenazi Jews, versus Mizrahi Jews, who are sort of from Arab countries and North Africa, and Sephardi Jews from Western Europe, mostly Spain and Portugal, as well as more recently Ethiopian Jews who've been immigrating to Israel. So everyone except the Ashkenazim not served by the Israeli state project, and very aware of this from the very early days of that project. So, Mizrahi children were stolen from their parents. Ethiopian immigrants have been kind of effectively forcibly sterilized by being given contraception without their knowing, all of this stuff. But then just as long as that history of oppression, we've had the history of resistance to it, which, culminates in the creation of the Black Panthers, the Israeli Black Panthers, not, I don't think, directly connected to the American Black Panthers, but obviously very inspired by them. But running protests, as early as the 1950s, and then kind of through the Black Panther kind of party, eventually standing for election in the Knesset. But so now we've got this situation where these Mizrahim, who were historically very opposed to the Zionist state and organized quite militantly against it, in their local areas as well as in the Knesset, being extremely allied with Likud, with Netanyahu's party. And interestingly, this obviously has some echoes for people who are listening to this in the UK, with the UK government, where we have loads of conservative, ministers or former ministers, Kwasi Kwarteng, Sajid Javid, Suella Braverman, Priti Patel, Rishi Sunak, who are South Asian or African. And this is it feels quite similar to Israel, where Mizrahim were somehow bribed by the political elites into thinking that they had shared interests. Can you tell us a bit about like how that happened? You sort of finished, I think, by talking about Mossad and the Israeli state cracking down on the Black Panthers as soon as they realized they were maybe getting too powerful or starting to make dangerous connections between the Mizrahi struggle and the Palestinian struggle.
Sure. I think very briefly, because there was such oppression against Mizrahi communities, and it was so associated, so deeply associated with the left, or the so-called left, the labor, was the one who was promoting racist policies against Mizrahim. And Likud, as a more nationalist party, was carrying an agenda of we are all Jews. Everyone deserves equality as Jews. So it was, really defining the terms of the discourse, saying oppression of Mizrahim is illegitimate, but not of Palestinians. They're outside of the fence. And if you want to resist the hegemony of the Ashkenazi, again, so-called left, because it was never like the hardcore left that has always existed here separately and was never in power. If you want to oppose that, Likud suggested to Mizrahim, you ally with us, and we can topple that regime of the Ashkenazi left. And that was successful in the late 70s, when after decades of essentially almost single rule of labor, they were replaced with Likud. And ever since, we've basically been in a Likud-led set of coalitions, one way or another, with very, very few exceptions.
Do we actually have statistics? Like, is it an overwhelmingly more Mizrahi votes to the Likud than Ashkenazi? Because
no, it's about 50-50. It's about 50-50. Yeah, it's not that Mizrahim vote to Likud more than Ashkenazim, but it is the case that Mizrahim vote more to the right in their own community than to the left.
In no way am I defending any of the radicalization processes of any part of the Israeli society, but I can tell you that a lot of Mizrahi communities that came from, Arab states, they came very traditional religiously. And the founders of Zionism were associated with extreme secularism. And so what the right wing was able to do is like build synagogues and tell all these communities that came as very traditional. My grandfather needed like what he had in Iran is a synagogue. Like he prayed to Zion. He didn't like want to take a gun and go to Zion. He was praying to Zion from Iran, from his synagogue. And so when the reality became as such that he had to come here to Israel, like all he wanted is a freaking synagogue. And the right wing were able to offer him, and they built more synagogues in those development towns and so I think that this is something that we have to look at, that like the traditional kind of like religiousness and stuff was kind of adopted by the right wing in order to bring these traditional communities to the right wing. And Shas, the big Sephardic Mizrahi ultra-Orthodox party, was able to offer this kind of like traditional religious home for many of those voters. And I just want to say that in all of the peace agreements, in all of the hostage deals, in everything, Shas, the Sephardic religious was always an ally to those agreements, to the Oslo agreements, to the hostage deal. Now they announced that they are backing a hostage deal ceasefire plan. And so, this discourse is a very complex one. It doesn't take away from the radicalization and the obvious turning to the right wing of everyone almost in Israel. And the Mizrahim is just a very fascinating case inside of that has more layers to it.
I totally get that. Yeah, so it's not that they're not exceptional in that they've kind of followed the drift of the rest of society, but they are interesting because obviously of their historic kind of political allegiances and their opposition to the Israeli state. Okay, we're jumping around a little bit here, but I want to talk a bit about Zionism and the left's kind of relation to it. It often feels to me from the outside like the Israeli left is in a bit of a game of catch up with the right, and sort of trying to show that it's sufficiently Zionist to be acceptable. At least, the parliamentary left plays that game. Obviously, we saw that in 2015 when Labour created this sort of centre-left alliance with Hatnoah to unseat Netanyahu, and it called it Hamachane Hazioni, the Zionist camp. Is it necessary for the left to play this kind of game, to sort of like, to profess a commitment to Zionism that maybe it doesn't really strongly have, or whatever, in order to bring people along? Like, is it necessary for the Israeli left, at least like in the parliament or in the kind of mainstream, to sort of profess commitment to Zionism, to pledge allegiance to Zionism, to just reassure people? Like, are we still at that stage?
I think a very significant shift has happened since 2009. So we're talking about the first big Gaza war and the return of Netanyahu into government. And it was around that time that Netanyahu and his allies, both in politics and in kind of civil society, started these campaigns to delegitimize the left as a political camp, to basically create this guilt by association, whereby, we start by saying all Palestinians are terrorists and they're the enemy. But then anyone who supports Palestinians or, is in shared parties with them, like the non-Zionist left, who opposes the occupation, they're colluding with the enemy. And kind of that association will just broaden basically indefinitely. So it's gotten to the point where you have Netanyahu accusing people of being leftists when they are within his own party or in a party that's actually to the right of him, because it's become such a curse to say that someone, to say that someone is a leftist basically means to say that they're traitors. And his campaign has been so successful, so masterfully planned, and has coincided with his success in removing the Palestinian issue from actual political debate. It used to be in the 90s and the early 2000s, the question around which Israeli politics is organized. And his success has been to basically make Palestinians irrelevant. When Noam was talking before about what we were trying to do, challenging the so-called pro-democracy protests and saying you need to pay attention to Palestinians, that was an absolute low point where people were only interested in Jewish Israeli society and forgotten completely about Palestinians. And then October 7th just kind of rattled the world. So over those 15 years, basically, there was this process of removing Palestinians from the table and from politics and delegitimizing anyone who associates with them. And that's what I think led people like Labour to try and rebrand and say, we're the true Zionists. We're kind of, like you said, kind of playing that game of catch-up.
Would either of you ever describe yourselves publicly as non-Zionist or anti-Zionist, or does it depend who you're talking to?
I want to have a conversation about like what is Zionism and what is a Zionist, because I mean, again, and I don't know if Haggai, how you come about to this, to this discourse, but I think for Jews in the UK and Jews in the US, it's very like a very dichotomical, Zionist, non-Zionist. Like, I mean, my grandfather from Romania, he escaped the freaking Nazis because of white Christian Western anti-Semitism. So he was able, like, he's a Holocaust survivor. And my grandfather in Iran truly saw Iran as his home. Like, my grandparents were born next to the tomb of Mordechai and Esther. Like, they were born next to a very holy site in Iran for Jews. So, the circumstances that brought both of my grandparents here to Israel in the late 50s, none of my grandparents were ever part of this taking arms, taking weapons. It was the circumstances that brought them here. And now their granddaughter is here trying to, fight for these consequences for what happened. I think it's an opportunity for us to look backwards and to ask ourselves, what is Zionism? What is being a Zionist? It is so urgent and so important for Israelis, to declare, we are proud Zionists. What does it mean? Like, what does it mean? And why do I have to fit myself into these narrow categories? I do not support a system that makes me superior for being a Jew. Does that make me an anti-Zionist?
Yes, I would say so, but it's okay.
Right. So I do not support a system that keeps my Palestinian friends, teachers, neighbors, community on their knees, oppressed, and don't have access to the very basic privileges that I have because I'm Jewish and they're not. So that if that makes me an anti-Zionist, let's have this fight together. I want to be a part of this struggle that ends me being superior to anyone just because I'm Jewish.
Yeah, I that really resonates with me. I think the conversation around what is Zionism is a very important one, especially because it just means different things to different people. I think to its critics, it is rightly identified with a settler colonial project, an apartheid regime, everything that Noam just said. It has been that for over 76 years, even since before the state was founded. It has been that sort of the political movement. And at the same time, it has been a rescue plan for people who survived the Holocaust or oppressive regimes and had very little place to go. And I think currently for people, there's a question of when many people say, especially people on the Zionist left would say that they're Zionists. I think to them it means we as Jewish Israelis have a right to live here. We have a right for collective rights as a national religious group. We have the right to self-determination. But many of them will also say that right does not negate or has to come at the expense of anyone else. So there are a lot of people who are my friends and my partners who would say, we are Zionists, we are Zionist left, and we actually agree on everything. I would tell them, I don't think that's a good description of Zionism. It's too narrow because Zionism has done so many terrible things as a political movement. You can't ignore that by saying, I'm imagining a different Zionism in which, just our rights are protected and everyone else's. But for people for whom that is Zionism, I don't want to tell them I'm against that. I do believe in our right to live here in the long run and enjoy safety and collective organizing. That is something I do believe in. So for some, that means that I'm a Zionist.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it is important to say that, maybe the founding fathers or founders of Israel, they truly wanted Zionism to work hand in hand with what Haggai is saying, human rights and democracy and all of those things. It hasn't worked on the ground. There is no proof that an escape plan, as Haggai was saying, for the Jews in a safe haven. It hasn't been a safe haven for Jews. We had the biggest massacre on Jews since the Holocaust just a few months ago. So on many, many different aspects, we haven't been able to prove that this plan is truthfully a rescue plan, not completely for Jews, and also, of course, not for Palestinians. There's another people, like two national entities that are trying to live and exist on this land. And so, I mean, if people who truly still believe in Zionism want to work tirelessly in trying to prove the world and to show the world that it can work without it being a system of Jewish superiority, go ahead, try. But I see my role here, if we want to continue living on this land, the path is only equality, and the path is only to end the systematic oppression that this system has allowed and has put not only Palestinians in danger and oppression and a lot of pain and grief. Let's talk about it, that it is extremely, extremely difficult to be Palestinian, to live under oppression. And also for people like Haggai and I who are trying to fight this system, it is so hard being part of the oppressor collective, trying to fight it. We are trying to fight our own society. We are trying to fight our own power mechanisms that exist in our society and in our government. And we do our best, and we vote for Palestinian representatives in the Knesset, and we organize, and we protest, and we write, and we tell jokes, and we perform, and we try to be as visible as possible. It is a tiring task to also be against your own people and try to challenge the power structure of your own people.
I totally get that. And it's obviously got exponentially harder in the past, few months since 7th of October. I mean, you alluded to it in the beginning, I think, both of you, how depressing it is, how scary it is. We already had, years ago, when I visited Israel many years ago, there was already kind of attempts to crack down on anti-patriotic culture and, just like some of the most insane stuff. But now, I mean, I can't even imagine what it's like. I think I was speaking to an Israeli who lives in the UK the other day, and they were saying that more and more people talk about hitpakachti, I've sobered up. Like there's some sense in which people on the left are like, well, that was just stupid and naive, and we've got to get real. We're in a war. Like we can't cling to these kind of idealist notions of peace now. And, I also saw a clip of the Haaretz columnist Gideon Levy, talking about, he's hardly the most radical guy on the planet, although I imagine in Israel he is considered quite a radical, saying that someone had come up to him on the street in Tel Aviv and called him a traitor. Like, what is it like to be? Is there any space for a left in Israel right now, if there ever was?
It's a very, very difficult time to be on the left in Israel right now. As we had discussed. First, I think just the actual risks. I'm not even talking about kind of discourse and are people willing to engage. Ever since October 7th, it has really become much more dangerous. And I'm talking about first and foremost Palestinian citizens, whom I think of as our partners within the left. And the silencing campaign, just arresting people for the most benign Facebook posts and Twitter posts, people just saying, my heart cries for Gaza. They can get arrested and in prison for a week. So the silencing campaign, beating up any protester that just holds up a sign, saying ceasefire now. These sort of things. It has gotten better over the past couple of months. It's not as bad as it was the first 3 months. But I think the kind of collective trauma from that was very meaningful. And that's just the official oppression, let alone we have institutions and places of work and universities that were kicking out workers and students for similar posts. And I can tell you, personally, I have a friend who's a journalist, and he participated in a joint kind of as memorial service for all children that were killed. And this is like a week after October 7th, for all children that were killed on both sides. And his house came under attack by hundreds of right-wing protesters. They were shooting fireworks at his house. He had to get the police to rescue him out and his family and go to a safe house. And for me, and this is crazy, I spent the first few months of the war when there was literal rocket fire on Tel Aviv, where I live, but I was more afraid of my neighbors if they find out what my opinions are, and I can face a similar reality as he did. So that's just kind of the fear, the actual risk around this. But beyond that, I think, like we said before, it's just become very, very difficult to puncture through. People's attention is exclusively focused on October 7th and the hostages. Nothing that has happened since in Gaza is making it through just a little bit when there's talk of the ICJ or the ICC or sanctions from Western powers. Suddenly people are like, wait, what's happening? What have we been doing? We haven't been following, and then they move on again. It's really hard to get people to understand what's happening in Gaza. And it's really hard to talk to people about alternatives when they see Hamas, and also to a certain degree when they see people who support Hamas abroad and saying and justifying the attack of October 7th. When they see that, they're like, our actual existence here is at risk, and it's either us or them. That's, I think, the kind of common sentiment right now. It's either us or them. And, I used to have these morals, but like you said, now I'm sobered up. If it's either us or them, I'm going to choose us. That's where most people are, and it's really, really hard to puncture through that.
And sorry, Haggai, for bringing this up, because maybe you don't, but I mean, Haggai's mother is like right now, as we speak in this moment, is going through like the most vicious, like cruel, disgusting, ugly, like campaign, like right-wing campaign that have put like signs against her only because she was showing solidarity with a Palestinian, former prisoner who has died. And I mean, I just drove by this sign yesterday, just kind of like how, quoting her and basically sending the public out there to like, attack and hate. And I mean, she's such an amazing, professor and writer, and she has changed so many people's lives, and she's done so many amazing things for this place, for Israelis and Palestinians, that I don't know, Haggai, sorry for putting you on the spot like this, but this is the topic of the podcast, and you are speaking to someone who his mother is currently going through this, kind of attack and silencing, and really, really a lot of, forms of violence and silencing. And I mean, there was a similar kind of like right-wing influencer with millions of followers who has done the same for my father. And just, it's looking at these messages that we get, that our parents get, that, just by chance saying the wrong word, having your name and your picture published somewhere can really get you into very, very dangerous and dark places. And to think that our Palestinian peers and colleagues and friends, they have been on mute because the consequences for them are much higher than the consequences for us.
I mean, I think there's also very little attention paid. You asked earlier, Noam, how much do people in the UK know about the protests, that Israelis have been holding against the government and against the war? Yes, a lot of those protests have been focused on the hostages and ensuring Jewish safety rather than the safety of Palestinians in Gaza or elsewhere. I'm sort of wanting to understand a bit better how that sort of hostage movement, the sort of which is a kind of ceasefire movement, and which has been portrayed, particularly by the right-wing media, Channel 14 and others, as being left-wing. From what I understand, the narrative in Israel at the moment is that if you're pro-hostage, you're on the left, and if you're pro-war, you're on the right. I think they even did some controversial analysis which showed that the hostage families or the hostages themselves were largely themselves left-wing, which just seems like an insane thing to publish. I think they had to apologize for it.
They did something even worse. They showed how the majority of those massacred on October 7th were leftists and how their opinions didn't save them.
Which is, oh God, that's absolutely vile. I mean, it's yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, what I was going to ask was, how does that hostage movement, which I think a lot of people listening to this will see as synonymous with Israeli propaganda, they'll see the hostage posters up around London, and see the people, in the UK, the people that are leading the sort of pro-hostage, bring them home type protests are the very pro-Israel organisations that are also advocating for the war. So in the UK, you get this collapse of the categories where they want the war, but they also want the hostages, which is kind of bonkers. But in Israel, what is that sort of pro-hostage movement? Is it part of the left? Is it next to the left? Is it sort of, something else? Help me to understand.
I think there is like a very large consensus that everyone wants the hostages home. Everyone's like hashtag hostages, bring them home, whatever. But I think those nuances come in when you ask, how will we bring them home? Like, how do you think they're coming home? And that's when there is this, fragmentation, where you see people who are like, no, we can't, I want the hostages home, but we can't stop the war. We can't stop what we're doing. And that's why the army rescue of 4 hostages was so just like a momentarily kind of like the wrong kind of happiness, because yes, of course, we're happy that 4 people came home, but at what expense? I mean, because we know when we look at the figures that the big numbers of hostages, if you want them home, can only be brought home with a ceasefire deal. And that's when you have the kind of differentiation, because being pro having the hostages home, that's easy. It's when you start digging into the how do you believe the hostages can get home?
We've seen kind of a process where in the beginning, the kind of release the hostages movement, which is led by the families, basically, of the hostages, was being very careful and very moderate, kind of like, just bring them home. We're not going to say how, we're not going to demand anything. We're not against the government. We want to work with the government on bringing them home. That was kind of the messaging initially. I think gradually 2 things have become very apparent. The first is that it is, as Noam said, either the hostages or the war. Like, the one thing stopping a hostage deal is that Hamas is saying we will only go for a deal if it's the end of the war, and the Netanyahu government basically saying, we will do anything except end the war. And that gap has just been there for months now, and there are kind of tides and sways and all sorts of developments around the negotiations, but those are the 2 positions, basically. And that's why, and the other thing is basically that Netanyahu, I think, recognizes the war as essential to rebuilding his brand that was deeply damaged after October 7th, kind of Mr. Security that is responsible for the worst catastrophe in Israeli history of security. So he was basically seen as kind of a dead man walking on October 8th. And I think he's been working very hard to sustain the war, to keep up and rebuild his political power. And therefore, he is associated with the war. The war is associated with not getting the hostages back. And therefore, gradually, the hostage families and the pro-hostage movement have shifted to being anti-government and anti-war, and all framed around the hostages. And that has made it very easy for other groups to join them, both the kind of anti-government protesters that we were mentioning before, the kind of pro-democracy protesters from the first year under this government have joined the movement because it's against the government, and the radical bloc, people like us, who have joined these protests saying, yes, end the war, yes, bring them back. And it's not only because we're suffering. Look at this incredible massacre of tens of thousands of Palestinians that we've killed, the starvation, the destruction. Like, you need to pay attention to that and stop the war also because of that. So you have these protests that are joint and shared between these different movements, kind of focus on hostages, focus on toppling the government, and focus on Palestinians and Gaza.
How have you both felt about the international left's response to the events of the 7th of October? And, the way that it has framed this as an Israeli genocide, Palestinians being, or Israelis being uniformly supportive of the war, or, other things that you've picked up from international media, both of you are fluent in English, and you've said read international media, and I'm interested in what you've made of the response. I mean, I include myself in this, as someone who prompted quite major backlash on the 7th of October for a tweet that I posted hastily and subsequently deleted and apologized for. I think my own thinking has been has evolved very rapidly and is still very much evolving. But I'm interested in, what have you made of how other people outside of Israel have responded to the war? What have their blind spots been? And how would you like, the international left to understand what's going on differently?
First of all, thank you for being honest. I think following October 7th, I also posted things that I really regretted and that I took down, and people were mad at me. And I think we all make mistakes, and I think that it's okay. And the fact that you're here and you're willing to learn and you are being very genuine and honest about it, I think that's the kind of discourse that we should be having, because people are so isolated right now, and they're so like, they don't want to listen. People are radicalized. People are emotional, and that's understandable as well. But we need to get to a level where, just like you did now, like you're saying, like I'm saying the mistakes that I did, and you're saying the mistakes that you did, and we got this wrong, and let's try to have an honest conversation. And I think, for me, I think just a few very, very basic things got lost on the way. Hamas is an extension of Israel enabling Hamas. If you're happy about something that Hamas did, I mean, sorry to tell you, this is kind of like Israel's extension. And the people who were massacred on October 7th did not deserve to be massacred in such a brutal and such a horrifying way. Some of them were people that we know that are activists just like us, who are helping us, to fight Jewish supremacy, whether it is in the West Bank or Gaza, and we're truly partners to this struggle that we should all be fighting with together. And so that's, one way to start this. To be honest, am pleased that people have woken up. I am pleased that students are protesting. I am pleased that there is a huge discourse. I am pleased that we're not back to the status quo where the occupation is just like a daily ongoing thing, but that people are waking up to the reality here and are willing to put their bodies on the line, to be interested in Palestine, to be interested in what's going on here, to raise their voices, to be involved. This is something, to get into the nuances of who said what and what the response of the progressive worldwide left. Like a lot of Israelis are very busy in being angry and disappointed. I just want people to help us to put pressure to end the system that enables this bullshit and this ugliness and this violence. And so if you are doing that from abroad, thank you. If you're protesting, if you care, if you have a podcast and you brought me and Haggai to speak to you, great. Let's continue that.
I think I hold a slightly different view. I mean, generally speaking, I'm also very, content, I guess the word, with the fact that there is such a growth in the movement, that people are resisting, that people are speaking up, that people are organizing. It's incredible, and it's inspiring, and it's really important. And it's the right thing to do. At the same time, I do think that there are discussions that need to be had about what this movement stands for. And the question of how people think of October 7th, kind of saying, it's all right for Palestinians to tear down the walls, to liberate themselves, to attack soldiers. Like that is true. Like it's their right. That's the right of resistance. At the same time, I think that we need to talk about Hamas, not only, I think it might be too easy to kind of say, it's serving Israel. No, Hamas, as its own agenda, with its own agency, has decided to massacre hundreds of civilians. And I think we need to talk about that. And Hamas has been saying, since many people in Hamas have been saying, that they want to do this again and again and again. This is just a prelude to what will happen to Israelis in the long run. And I think it's essential to recognize that and to speak up against that for two reasons. Like, one is because we're on the left and we support, the rights of people to live, and we oppose war crimes, and we think that civilians should not be targeted. Like these are basic tenets of who we are and what we stand for. So I think you can't celebrate such an attack on civilians. And the other is also practical, because we're seeing this trend within Israel of saying, wait, if this attack is meant to destroy and kill or deport every last Jew from this country, and if that message gets support from people abroad, then of course we're in either us or them situation. Of course we need to fight this out till the end, and we have no other recourse. Whereas a more nuanced message of being consistent in opposing Israeli war crimes since before October 7th and after October 7th, of course, alongside criticizing Hamas for its actions, would allow a healthier political discourse that recognizes the rights of Jews to live here alongside Palestinians in equality, that tells people we're not against you. We want to work with you to ensure the future of all peoples. And I think that would be a very, very different message for Jewish Israelis to hear, but before that, to their allies abroad. So if we're looking, for example, at American politics, for Biden to oppose the war, I think that he needs kind of J Street to oppose the war. And for them to oppose the war, they need to be very, very clear on how opposing the war does not mean that we're kicking out all the Jews from here. So I think you need those allies. So it's also practical alongside being just a moral question. And in that sense, while I've seen many people take excellent positions over the past 8 months, I've also seen people who either deny or justify the massacre of civilians, and that has been painful and disappointing.
I totally feel that. And I think that's something that I have learned, the hard way, but I think a very important lesson about that. I think there's something also about how a lot of the discourse, I know you said, Noam, it's not about the discourse, we shouldn't focus too much on the discourse, but there is something interesting about how, in our discussions of the war, we, like, at least in the UK and maybe the US and things that I've seen, have tended to assume that, have tended to sort of, in some ways, like, essentialize Israelis as one thing in the same way that Israel essentializes Palestinians as one thing, Hamas and Palestinians, and every 8-year-old Palestinian as Hamas and all this stuff, when actually the war doesn't really serve the Israeli working class. And just as, Russia uses Russian peasants as cannon fodder for its war in Ukraine and its illegal invasion, Ashkenazi elites, Netanyahu more than anyone else, is using predominantly Mizrahi and Sephardi, or not predominantly, but disproportionately Mizrahi and Sephardi IDF soldiers as cannon fodder, and also the hostages as cannon fodder, and to sort of drive this military campaign, which really doesn't have Jewish safety at its heart, but really like the preservation of this political system. So do you feel like there could have been more awareness, there could be more awareness of that, of how there is, the war is exacerbating internal class and race dynamics within Israeli society? There was a very interesting piece in 972 about just this, Haggai, by someone called Roy Cohen, about how the war was largely affecting, obviously, the border areas and the kibbutzim where many activists live. And it's quite interesting. And I just don't think people think about it as a internal class struggle within Israeli society.
I wonder about that. I think to a degree it's true. I mean, looking back at that story you mentioned by Roy Cohen, what he was paying attention to was the way different communities that were evacuated from border areas were treated differently. So elite Ashkenazi communities were better organized and were getting better reparations and better conditions, while Mizrach communities in those same places were getting worse conditions. But I'm not sure that this is necessarily, beyond that question of reparations, that it's necessarily such a precise use of these categories. I mean, the main targets of October 7th attack were, people who lived in kibbutzim and moshavim along the border, a lot of Ashkenazim, a lot of people associated with the political left, a lot of elites, secular youth at the party. So not necessarily your kind of traditional Mizrahi working class folks. And the same has been true of people who've been evacuated both in the north and the south. It's all sorts of communities. It's true that Israel has not been taking care of these communities, and the insistence on prolonging the war has not offered these communities who are now internally displaced for 8 months any more safety than they had 8 months ago. So that's true. I don't know about necessarily about the kind of class layering aspect.
I feel like one thing that has definitely come out of October 7th and the aftermath is a shaking up of the Israeli kind of political status quo, and the idea, it's sort of blown open this idea that it's possible to manage the conflict through periodically mowing the lawn or, maintaining the occupation. Like, something fundamentally needs to change for Israel to survive, and certainly for Palestinians to survive. And I wonder whether, to try and end on a note of optimism, that fact opens up a new space of possibility for the left, that things can't remain how they are.
I am always trying to imagine, to use my political imagination and to try to think, I remember as a little girl kind of going from seeing my dad in the first Intifada go in and out of military prison to seeing my parents hopeful about the peace agreements, the Oslo peace agreements. Never mind that we have lots of criticism on that, and there's a whole conversation to be had about the problems of the Oslo agreements and everything. But I often think about the transition that my parents had between going from the first Intifada into a process. There was some kind of a process. There was some kind of something to look forward to. And I think that now we are in an even worse situation than they were back then. And there is going to be so much need for us to fight, to protest, to voice our opinions, to fight for the public discourse, to show our, presence, and also to center Palestinians and to show their voices and to amplify their voices. In order for us not to go backwards into the time where we think that a status quo and the putting on the band-aids on the situation can simply be called normal life. So I really, really hope that, I'm saying this with great sorrow and great grief, because what I worked for my whole life, and so many people around me like Haggai and so many other activists and writers and artists and political activists and so many people around me, we didn't want to get to a point where there is so much loss of life for people to listen to us and to know for a fact that the status quo is not sustainable. We wanted to save as many lives in order for us to get into a process of justice and to find ways to end the occupation and end the oppression, and to be the generation that can somehow enter an era where we are equal on this land. And the fact that we needed to get to a place where so many lives are lost and there is no real vision for our future here, in order for people to see for a fact that the status quo is unsustainable, is truly heartbreaking. And on top of that, I hope that this would lead us to a way where we're not going backwards.
Tragically, right now, it seems like that realization that the status quo is not sustainable in Israeli politics is translated into one or out of two things. One solution that is being proposed is a much more extreme attitude towards Palestinians. So, it hasn't been sustainable to keep things as they were. So we need to ethnically cleanse, the entire land. We need to, increase our oppression of Palestinians. We need to rebuild settlements. That is a very powerful trend right now. The other very powerful trend is saying the status quo is not sustainable, but one form or another of a status quo is the best we can hope for. We don't have a political imagination of anything better. So we need to go back to some sort of a status quo that is slightly more violent, that is slightly more oppressive, not go all the way, get rid of 2 million people in Gaza, but we need to find a way to retrieve a status quo, I think is kind of a growing sentiment in Israeli society. And both those attitudes are extremely dangerous and extremely detrimental to any chance of anything becoming better here. At the same time, to just kind of end on a slightly more optimistic note, we do have a long history where significant traumas breed a change in public opinion. So we had the Yom Kippur War in 1973 with Egypt, and 5 years later there was a peace agreement with Egypt that has survived ever since. And it was the first Intifada, and then after that, the Oslo years. As Noam said, look, we have a lot of criticism of the way the Oslo paradigm worked, but society has shifted deeply from being in a place of we don't recognize the PLO, it's a terrorist organization, to we want to talk to them about them having a state of their own. That was a huge shift in public consciousness over just a few years. I think the trauma of October 7th is still very fresh. It is still very much alive, with the hostages still there, with the war ongoing. But it doesn't necessarily mean that what we're seeing now in the political responses and solutions being offered is what we'll see in 2 or 3 or 4 years, where people will have had time to calm down, get over the trauma of the event, and really ask some hard questions that are not being asked right now in terms of how we got here and how do we avoid getting back to the same set of circumstances that bred October 7th. So my hope is that past experience and the work that we do and the support we get from allies internationally, creating more and more pressure on Israel, will lead to some sort of change like that. It doesn't look like that right now, but we need to be able to imagine something like that happening down the line.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, I think the context is also somewhat different to previous wars in that, like I said, you don't have the left internationally offering the same kind of support, which I suppose could harden Israeli society against sort of more progressive solutions, or could kind of add pressure and sort of, you know, things like you didn't have the ICJ case or the ICC, you know, ruling against Israel or sort of investigating Israel, at least issuing, you know, seeking to issue arrest warrants, you know, at that time. And so things have, you know, outside of Israel, the landscape is much more kind of pushing for a radical solution. So I suppose that could shape the discourse after the war ends. But yeah, thank you so much, both of you, for joining us on Novara FM. It's been a very like diverse and rich discussion, and I hope people will see it through, because I think there's been so much here to pay attention to.
Thanks, Rivkah.
Thank you for having us.
Support independent journalism and set up a regular donation to Novara Media from just £1 a month. Head to novara.media/support.